Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everybody, I am really delighted to invite today's guest, Megan Leatherman. Megan is the founder and director of A Wild New Work, an ecological career development agency based in the Pacific Northwest. As a career coach, mother, writer, podcast host, and amateur ecologist, Megan has helped thousands of professionals reconnect to their strengths and to what deeply matters to them. She has a master's degree in conflict resolution, a background in human resources, and believes that our work can be a spiritual practice. You can learn more about her at awildnewwork.com, and you will find that and many other resources in the show notes to learn more about her work and all that she's doing in the world. So please join me in welcoming Megan Leatherman. And we talked about that you're not related to the Leatherman tool people.
Right.
That's okay. You have your own toolbox. So welcome, Megan.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So Megan, as you know, on Work from the Inside Out, we like to start at the beginning, your earlier years, your formative years, and talk about, things that might have influenced or not, how you went about the work that you're doing today. So start us at an earlier point and tell us a little bit about your earlier life.
Yeah. The thing that stands out to me when I sort of look back at the threads from childhood and from the past are really the amount of time I got to spend outdoors, sort of often alone or with a small group of people. I was the oldest of 5 kids.
Oh,
so
wow.
I, got good at entertaining myself. I realized at a certain point that I was never bored. I never needed like a drawing pad in the car or whatever. I just really loved absorbing the environment. And I always felt really intrigued by who was around and the sort of ecological setting. So, I grew up in Oregon in this beautiful landscape. And those are the things that really stand out when I think about where I am now, and the sort of echoes of that from the past is just this really easy, childlike, just beautiful connection and getting to spend time outside and connecting to something larger than myself.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Wow. So take us forward then. So you grew up in the same town most of your life?
Yeah, I grew up around Eugene, Oregon, which is a couple hours south of Portland, in the Willamette Valley. And when I was in middle school, my parents had always had this dream of moving out to the country. So they bought this house in the country with 20 acres. And it was just open, wide open space with forest and fields. And I think it was really, in some ways, it was hard to be so far from town and kind of remote, and it's like a long drive in. But in other ways, when I was home, I just could sort of fully let down. There wasn't sort of the activity of being in an urban environment. And, I would walk on the trails there, and the land wasn't they didn't really, quote, do anything with it. Like it wasn't farmed or anything. So I think, benefited from being a young person who could just be out and be free to explore and walk around and all that.
That is nice. So you moved out there probably in your early adolescence, would you say? Yeah. So that's kind of a critical time when things are changing. Your perspective on who you are in the world is changing. So that was a big change. And yet you were the oldest of 5. So you had your own little, I'd say, baseball team with you.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Always a big crew wherever we went.
Yeah. Wow. So that's where you lived your teenage years, and it just sounds so pristine. There's something nice about that. How I think about how I grew up. I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and we used to be able to go out on our bikes or go over to a neighbor's house. No big deal. By the time I raised my daughter in the suburbs, she was driven everywhere and everything was, much more guarded. So it sounds like you were able to really sort of roam more freely and just experience your environment that way.
Mm-hmm, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. With my kids now, they're 2 and 5, and it's a big difference when we go for a walk in our neighborhood and there's cars and people everywhere versus when we take them to this sort of natural open setting where I don't have to, monitor their every movement. It's just this sense of like safety and ease. They can just run around and, I think connect to these other, animals and plants that are part of this ecosystem that they don't maybe interact with on a daily basis. But yeah, I think that really informed my perspective as a young person, and it was really important.
Yeah. So once you finished high school, did you go right off to school, or what? Tell us more about your kind of pathway to a more professional life. Were there things that you got interested in those earlier years that you started thinking about, who do I want to be when I grow up kind of thing? Or did you kind of just wait till you got there to begin working on that?
Mm-hmm. I never really had a conscious idea of what I wanted to do, but I grew up in a really religious home, and we were really involved in the church. And that was sort of an anchor for me through adolescence. And I went to a small Catholic high school, and I did try out some sports, but I don't really identify as an athletic person, but they had something called retreat team.
Retreat
team. And I joined the retreat team, and I got to plan our junior and senior years. We had like these retreats where we would plan for students to go to like a cabin or, a monastery. And that was like, if I had to do sports, that was like exactly the thing that fit for me. It really opened my eyes to this more like contemplative, introspective approach where you're stepping out of daily life and intentionally taking time to connect to your peers and connect to the natural world and yourself. And that for me was, it was just so like fun and enriching and rewarding. And so when I was thinking about college, I just felt like it was still in line for me to go to a small religious school kind of as an extension of my high school. So I chose a school in Seattle called Seattle Pacific University, which is a small liberal arts United Methodist school. And it was very different, obviously, living right in the heart of Seattle. It's like right in the middle of the city.
Wow.
But yeah, that was a really lovely experience. I ended up majoring in psychology and minored in women's studies. And, as part of your experience there, you're expected to learn theology and go to chapel and all of that. And so my whole sort of social world was oriented around people who, practiced Christianity. And I remember signing up for women's studies just on a whim. I just needed this like 1 credit, and that was the only class that fit for my schedule. And I see that as a really like pivotal, fateful moment, because that sort of cracked everything open for me. Learning about the history of feminism and women's rights and, gender equality. It just sort of, not intentionally, because it was still in a Christian college and the professors were all Christian and all of that, but it really opened my worldview to start questioning some of the things that I assumed and grew up assuming and assumed about myself. And that was sort of the beginning of my own spiritual transformation. I ended up co-founding this club that was focused on women and gender rights at the school. They had a long way to go in terms of like, sexism and all of the baggage that is tied up in college campuses and Christian college campuses. And so started this sort of underground sort of club of people who were interested in talking about some of these things. Yeah.
Oh, so it wasn't an official.
We did end up becoming official.
Oh, you did. Okay.
But it was controversial. And that was, but I ended up making like some really amazing friends and really learned how to reconstruct my own beliefs and talk about them and explore other perspectives. And so in the process of that class and that club, I was in this class called Women in Christianity, and the professor who I was really close to was talking about this one thread of Christianity called Calvinism. And my interpretation of it, I don't know if this is really accurate. I'm not a theologian, but something she said was akin to like, our fate is predestined. And so if you're not sort of destined to go to heaven or into, the afterlife, then my sense was that like there was nothing I could do. And something about that, again, this also felt really fateful. It felt like it was kind of the end of something and the beginning of another. That weekend, I ended up having like my one and only panic attack about, everything that I had sort of believed felt like it was crumbling. And it just was this sort of awakening. And I ended up meeting with that professor. She was gracious enough to meet with me like at her kids' baseball game. And I was like, wow. I'm having a ton of doubts. This is really scary. I'm freaking out.
Yeah.
And she was so supportive and helpful. But I just sort of decided that day that like my faith needed to be something that I made my own that felt congruent to me. And that path just no longer felt like the right thing, but I didn't know what else to head into.
Right.
So that was the beginning of this sort of 7-year hiatus from anything that even felt religious. I felt disillusioned, and it just all sort of fell away without a replacement. And so that was a really incredible time, one, because I was sort of making my own way and my own sense in the world, but also really difficult because, of course, it was hurtful for my parents, for me to tell them, like, I don't have this faith anymore. My social network shifted, because all of my friends went to church and were really involved. And I didn't have any other guidance system. I had nothing else to hold on to really. Right. And so when I started thinking about what I wanted to do after I graduated, I just sort of defaulted, to some of the social services work that I had been volunteering in. And so I ended up, after graduating, taking a job at this shelter for domestic violence survivors that I had been volunteering at. And they had like an in-house cleaning, maintenance, like care person role. So I graduated college and moved into this shelter and lived there and worked there. But it had to be confidential because survivors are fleeing to this place.
Right.
And that was just such the wrong move for me. It was so isolating. I couldn't even tell anyone where I lived. It's also like just hard to live around people who are actively in crisis, of course. So I didn't last very long there. I think I stayed for the summer and ended up moving back home to Eugene. Just without any real sense of direction or rootedness.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That must have been, that must have been an incredibly difficult time.
It was. Yeah, it was pretty dark.
I think about, that time in life when you're finishing school, you're trying to figure out who you are. You know, it's that first point when you're supposed to be, okay, you're done with school now. You're an adult. Go get a job. Start taking care of yourself. I mean, this is, of course, stereotypical, but I think this is what quite a few people go through. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait a minute, September comes around. Oh, I don't have to go back to school again. Your whole orientation, your whole routine has been blown out of the water. And for you, this foundation that you were raised with, this religion, these principles, these values that you had, decided were not working for you anymore. That was huge. That was bold for you to really not only face that, but then also have those conversations with your parents and other people. And then to graduate, take on this pretty tough job and then go home again. I can imagine that being just enormously challenging to your soul and your spirit and everything, and trying to figure out who am I now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you're in that place, it's so easy to try to find reflections or for someone, you're looking for someone to tell you who you are, because it's not coming from within you. So yeah, I made a lot of not great choices about, who I hung out with and what I did on the weekends, and, partied too much, and was just, when I think about it, I just feel like I was just at sea, like totally getting, pummeled by all these different waves and not really having anything to hold me down or to connect with. Of course, my family was supportive and I lived at home, but yeah, that just emotional and spiritual time felt really tumultuous, and I just felt so lost.
Wow. Well, I have to say, even though you're way beyond that now, I'm glad that your family hung in there with you, because I have heard stories of certain families when, one of their children decides to depart from a particular, set of beliefs. Sometimes the family doesn't hang in there with them. So I give them a lot of credit for, being there for you through all of this.
Me too. Yeah. My parents have always been great at telling me that, their love is unconditional. There's nothing I could ever do to change that. And I do think they stand out in their open-mindedness and ability. Even now, we can talk about spiritual things, even though we're not on the same page. And I'm just so grateful for that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, it's like you're not on the same page in one way, and in another way, you're on the same page because you can have these conversations and talk about even what is different and just appreciate the time you have together.
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
Now, are they still out in the country there on the acres and acres of land?
No, after all the kids left, it's a huge house that was vacant. So they live at the beach now. On the Oregon coast.
Really?
Yeah, I know, poor them.
That's tough. So you have to go visit them at the beach.
It's horrible. Yeah.
Oh my
Ocean
goodness.
view. Yeah.
Wow. Well, they certainly have chosen a lot of nice outdoor locations.
I know.
So wow. So that was a lot that you took on after grad. I love this. We graduate, we're so proud of ourselves. We have our degree, and then boom, it's like life just stares you in the face and says, okay, who are you now, kid? Right. So, as you said, you ended up moving home and making some not great decisions, but still having the safety and stability of living at home. What was the returning point there somewhere along the way? What kinds of things did you end up deciding or doing along the way there in those earlier years?
Well, I never studied abroad in college, but it was always something that I really wanted to try. And so, being at home, feeling pretty low, like I just felt like I needed something, I don't know, big, or like something to take me out of this slump, I guess. And, I like I said, I was really involved in my women's studies program and cared a lot about that, and ended up deciding that I wanted to volunteer abroad with some sort of women's organization. And I think I was just looking up on that. I don't even know if it's still around, but idealist.org. They used to like match you with volunteer opportunities. And I just came across this Palestinian women's organization in Israel that was looking for volunteers to just help with like office work, and got in touch with them, and ended up like fundraising for myself and trying to go, and ended up moving there and living in Israel for 3 months, helping at this organization. And yeah, it was intense. I had never lived abroad before. I lived in an apartment with another woman who was volunteering. She's from Spain. And yeah, like any young person traveling for the first time in their life, it was, earth shattering, but it definitely, like, I think travel is so beautiful in that it does help you reconnect to who you are. And like, all right, you're in this place where you don't really speak the language. You're at the mercy of these strangers. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to handle yourself? And also just being in such an ancient, incredible, very spiritual place was, life-changing.
I bet. Mm-hmm. So, and 3 months can go by very quickly, and yet you were in such a different environment. Were you in a major city there in Israel, or where were you?
Yeah, it's called Haifa. It's on the northern coast. Yeah, in the Galilee. And so I had access to all these amazing villages in the Galilee, Nazareth, went to Jerusalem, the West Bank, obviously Tel Aviv. So got to travel a lot and be on the Mediterranean.
Wow. So that was a good decision.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I was starting to find my way a little bit.
Yeah. Now, was that volunteer engagement, was that intentionally 3 months, or was that just at 3 months you decided to be done? Or
I decided before I left that 3 months was what I could afford. And
I see.
So that was sort of the plan. So yeah, I did that. And while I was there, I had been applying to the Peace Corps to join the Peace Corps. And so was exploring that opportunity, but had also, being in Israel, Palestine, you can't help but think about conflict and conflict resolution. And
absolutely.
And so I was working with a Palestinian organization in Israel. So that was sort of top of mind for their people. So I had just sort of started looking at conflict and dispute resolution graduate programs, thinking that might be something I want to learn more about. And sure enough, at the University of Oregon in my hometown, there was this program through the law school on conflict and dispute resolution. And so I applied and then ended up, coming back home from Israel like planned, and interviewed for the Peace Corps and got the green light for that, but also had been accepted into this grad program and decided that that was the right thing for me. So I took a job in the interim. I took a job at my dad's insurance agency, totally like a total diversion.
Wow.
I just needed to get paid. Yeah. And got my own place finally. And then started grad school, kind of not having no idea what that really meant. And it may not have been, I don't know if I'd go back and do it. Like, it wasn't the most thoughtful decision. I think for a lot of people, grad school can feel kind of like a safety net that you can just sort of fall into. And I think that is what it was for me. But, I met my now partner there and made lifelong friends. And I do think I certainly don't regret it. But when I think about my motivations for getting into it, it was definitely out of like fear and wanting to feel sort of safe and held in something.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people make that decision about grad school. Some of them make it right out of undergrad. So, I give you some credit for going through some rough stuff, even though it was rough, that you gave yourself a chance to experience some living in between. And so did you go ahead and finish the program?
I did. Yeah. And actually, as part of that, you do like a practicum or not a thesis, but some sort of major project. And I actually ended up moving back to Israel to work at that organization again as part of my research project. I was studying women in Arab villages who were, and like indigenous Arab conflict resolution methods.
Wow.
And so I was there for 9 months doing that research and volunteering. Yeah. And that was, it was so different going back, older with a clear purpose. And that was, again, formative in its own different way. So that was incredible. But by the end of it, I was pretty burnt out and had sort of come to the conclusion that I didn't want to work with women in conflict zones like I had thought. And so finished my paper, and was so grateful for that experience, but then was at another point where I was like, oh, well, great. I know I don't want to do that. Now, what am I going to do with this degree that I just got? And so I ended up taking a job at a shelter for at-risk youth, and did that and was just sort of in this holding pattern as I finished my paper and graduated, having no clue really what I was going to do. But my then boyfriend, now husband, was moving to Boston to start a different grad program. And we just decided I would move there. And, I had nothing keeping me in Eugene anyway, and had this really expensive degree that hopefully would fit in somewhere else. And so I just sort of on a whim moved to the East Coast with him. And that started a whole other chapter.
So tell us, take us forward then.
Yeah, well, I got there and had nothing lined up. I had some money in savings and had the garage sale before you move and sold everything I owned. So I had this little tiny cushion. And I had been applying for things, but nothing was coming through. And, it's sort of a hard time. I had jobs, but nothing for super long, right? Because it was after college, but before I traveled. And then I had this 3-month thing, and it's I think it was hard for recruiters to place me. And I didn't even know what I wanted really. So I ended up just signing on with this temp agency and did a couple of temp jobs in the area, and finally got one at this organization called Next Step Living, and was working for $10 an hour, just doing data entry there. And it was this startup in home residential energy efficiency. And it was a cool, young, hip sort of startup scene. And I was working as a temp, and eventually they invited me to stay on full time in a different role. It was this customer service role where it was this specific team that was different than regular customer service. It was for everyone who was seriously upset or something had gone wrong. It wasn't just answering the phone. It was I have a problem. So I'm on the phone for 8 hours a day with people who are not happy, trying to, flex some of those conflict resolution skills and negotiate.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, totally. So that was a hard job, but I was empowered to make decisions about financial settlements and the plan. And it was actually a lot of, I felt very empowered, and I had a really wonderful manager. And so that was that felt like my first real professional job, not just these shorter term things in social services or volunteer gigs, but a real job. And so I did that and got promoted and took on larger and larger cases. And then just felt for me, that kind of work, being on the phone a lot with people who are unhappy, was pretty taxing and energetically depleting. So I started networking internally with some people on the HR team, and I just let them know, this is my background. I'd love to learn more about what you do. I'm interested in doing that. And between that conversation and when they actually offered me a job was 6 months to a year, maybe, but we just sort of kept kept chatting and checking in, and finally something opened up. And I give them a lot of credit too, because I had zero experience in HR. I had no business really like moving into that, but they offered me this role and I took it. And that felt like sort of the beginning of this current chapter. I got to learn a lot about employee experience and the nuts and bolts of HR. It wasn't an easy job or not stressful, but it's a way different stress than being on the phone with customers all day. So I felt like I could use different parts of my brain. And that was such a joy to transition. I felt like okay, here's something I can actually sort of hold on to and make sense. And I really thought that HR was going to be my long-term career path.
Yeah. It's funny how when you find something that you really enjoy a lot and you're still, on the younger end of your career, you think, this is it. I found my it thing. Mm-hmm. And, we know that probably the majority of us don't have that one it thing, that our careers aren't really formed in that one straight line, that we usually do have more than one career in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. Clearly you had a few of them already at that point, but without those experiences, you wouldn't have known to keep pivoting and moving and making those moves. I mean, even though, you probably felt a little bit lost as you were moving from one, like, I didn't know what to do. So I, got this job with these at-risk youth and, you did these things, but, you could have said, well, I'm not going to go work with at-risk youth. I'm going to go work in a supermarket. You clearly made some choices along the way to put yourself in, front facing with people in certain ways. Right. And it's interesting how that evolved over time. And, that you did take that interest in HR. What was that initial job that you had with them? I'm curious what the role involved.
I was an HR generalist,
okay,
which was like probably way higher than I should have been like at that point. But I was just sort of in charge of coordinating with a certain group of employees and making sure they had answers to their questions and knew their benefits. And I was in charge of the onboarding process. They were doing a lot of hiring. So all of the sort of day-to-day HR roles. And I did that for about a year and then got promoted into an HR manager role that was a little more specialized.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you were enjoying it, if that you were sticking with it. Because I get the feeling that if you were really not into it, you would have started looking elsewhere.
I was really invested. I was really enjoying it. I felt, that surge of like ambition. I mean, it was this young company where like you really could go as far as you wanted. I got promoted quickly. They were growing. Like it was really exciting. I also still didn't have great coping skills, or like I still was in this, underneath the surface was still in this period of feeling pretty lost at my core. And I think a lot of what I was looking for was found through that job in terms of like direction. Like I had a clear place to be, I could work as much as I wanted. I was, kind of rewarded for working on weekends and in my free time. I felt a sense of like identity. I got a lot of validation from it. And so it fed a part of me that was pretty empty and hungry. And that wasn't a problem, but it also sort of ate me up. I mean, I'd only lasted like a year and a half in this role. I think
the manager role.
Yeah. Well, in the whole HR role itself.
Okay. I see.
Yeah. I just was working a ton. It was an open office situation. So, I know now that I'm a very like sensitive person and very introverted, and I just, I just did not have the coping skills to really thrive and make that work sustainable.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So take us there a little bit, because you've alluded to that a little bit along the way, like being on the phone all day with people who are unhappy. Now, I can imagine many people would probably find that to be draining, to listen to that all day, or to try to problem solve all day with people's complaints and concerns. But you did just mention that the HR job did start to take a toll on you, and that perhaps you were still feeling somewhere at your core a little lost. And you were probably still in your 20s at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I don't know about everyone who's listening, but I remember being in my 20s and still feeling like I was still trying to figure out who I wanted to be in the world. And you don't always feel like your 2 feet are firmly planted on the ground in some ways. And I can imagine if you're an introvert and you're, kind of a sensitive person, all that stimulation, all that people contact, that's going to wear you down.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, totally. I can't speak to anyone else's experience, but for me,
Sure.
There's this woman, Elaine Aron, has done a lot of work on what she calls the highly sensitive person, which is a neurological makeup or way of being in the world where I process stimuli and sensory stimuli much more deeply. So standing in this office with like 200 people having their own conversations and all of that noise, and also trying to like totally, stay attuned to what my VP of HR is telling me and like keep a track of everything I have to do. It was so draining, like down to my bones. I just felt bone tired all the time and started having hormonal issues. My eating was way out of balance. I definitely drank too much, was sleeping, my sleep wasn't regulated. It just was like a burden that was just too heavy for me to carry. And I know other people do. And maybe it's not so difficult, but it just was like me and my nervous system, I just like cannot exist in this environment. Even though the people were wonderful and I was well treated, it just became clear that it wasn't sustainable for me. And then, like Boston is also its own very active, vibrant, like compared to Portland, it's like, it was a lot to live there and try to make a life there. So I ended up deciding I needed to come back to Oregon and sort of find the ground again. Yeah.
And now, when did you, I can imagine if you were feeling this way, that it was feeling like it was too much. I'm curious if you were being hard on yourself around that. Did you realize that you probably fit kind of I hate to say it like this, like a profile or that there are people like yourself, and there are other people I've interviewed, other people here on the podcast who identify as being sensitive people, and they've come to a point where they've said, you know what, this is how I need to take care of myself. This is how I navigate different environments, because I know that if I'm in a certain environment or in a certain type of environment for too long, it drains the life out of me, or I start turning into someone I don't want to be. And I know that I need to, take better care of myself under certain circumstances. Was there a point at which you realized, this is just who I am? There's nothing wrong with me. I just have certain needs to live a certain way.
Yeah, I remember I started this habit of getting into the office like at 7 a.m. because I wanted quiet time to like focus. And my boss she would also show up at 7 a.m. and she was older than me and had been in this field a lot longer. And I realized, like, here's this person who has done this and was so good at her job. And like, she's done this for so many years and she still feels like she needs to get here at 7 a.m. to keep up with everything. And I was like, I can't sustain that. I can't do this for that long. And I didn't feel hard on myself. I was more just like so wrapped up in my own like discomfort. Like I just couldn't believe like we were all working this much and it seemed normal. I did start to feel like, this may be normal, but it's certainly not natural. Like, what are we all doing? Like, no one wants to be working 12 hours a day. Like, this isn't actually that interesting or important. I can love what I do, but like, this isn't living. And so I felt like, congruent, or like it made sense to me that I would want to leave. That it wasn't necessarily that I had failed. I just wasn't really bought into that way of living and working anymore.
Wow. Well, good for you. I mean, good for you that you saw it that way. Cause I could see where some people might say, what's wrong with me? How come all these other people can do this? And it seems to be bothering me more than it's bothering other people, something along those lines. So when did you identify though the specifics of, let me ask you a different way, actually. How do you distinguish between someone who might be an introvert? And I know that introverts, come in many shapes and sizes, and being a highly sensitive person. There are some distinctions and differences, aren't there?
I think so. I think the way that my therapist has explained high sensitivity as being a little different is that it's not just that I get tired or like that being around others or around stimulating things drain me and then I need to recharge on my own, which is what I understand is the definition of introversion.
Yeah.
It's more like, it's like this sense of like my system shutting down and feeling like I feel real distress with like a lot of loud noise. I feel kind of flooded and overwhelmed, like something just sort of gets offline. Whereas like with introversion, my understanding is that you're okay. It's just that you need to recharge in this other way. So I don't want to make it sound like so horrible. Like I can function and fine and all of that. But being in a really loud office with a really demanding job, I just couldn't. I mean, I just was totally fried. And it wasn't enough to like be home alone all weekend or recharge. It was like, I can't, like my system is just like not regulating.
Yes, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So you moved back to Oregon. I assume maybe you brought your boyfriend with you at the time?
Yeah, he sort of reluctantly agreed to move back. He's from Virginia, so was really happy to be kind of on the East Coast. But luckily we wanted to be together, so we agreed to move back to Oregon. And I'm so grateful. My supervisor at this HR job, I gave my notice thinking like, being worried that he'd be like, you can leave now, like forget the 2 weeks or whatever.
Right.
Because it wasn't a great time. It was a really demanding period. And, but I'm so thankful he was really good at like exploring all of the options. I thought like, I'm going to give my notice and this is it. And he was like, well, would you be willing to stay on as a consultant? Could you contract with us? And I was like, oh my God, like I didn't even know that was a possibility, and so he gave me this like lifeline. I ended up contracting with them for like a year doing these HR consulting projects. And, I could work from home alone. And that was like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for that opportunity. That was my first sort of experience with self-employment. I could do work, but like on my own time by myself. I'm not in this really stimulating environment. I really felt like that was when things started to shift and I could kind of come back to myself and start pulling things apart and reconfiguring them in a new way.
Well, you know what else is interesting about that too is it sounds like you were able to, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it sounds like you were able to still do some work that you enjoyed doing, but in the right under the right conditions. So it wasn't so much that there was anything wrong with HR work. You were actually enjoying the work. It was the conditions under which you were doing them that was really creating, I guess, almost a cognitive dissonance for you. And it's nice when you can distinguish that. I find that with a number of my coaching clients, and maybe you find the same thing with yours, sometimes it's hard when someone's unhappy at work to distinguish, did I pick the right line of work? Did I pick the right avenue? Or is it the culture I'm in? Or is it the boss? I mean, I find often when somebody comes to me that they're actually it might be in the right lane. They like the work, but they start to lose their sense of what they actually like because the environment in which they're doing it has become so toxic that they can't even figure out what they like anymore.
Totally. And all of the work that they do like can get sort of imbued or like lost in the midst of all of this other, office politics or the relationship with your boss. And so you start to lose that connection to what it is that you actually enjoy. Yeah.
So how nice, they kept you on for about a year. And then what did you do after that?
Well, in the midst of that, there were certain points where it wasn't like a full-time project or I needed something else. So I ended up taking on a couple of other HR consulting kind of gigs, like through mutual connections. And so, I had a couple of clients. I was also applying for full-time HR jobs thinking like, oh, well, I should just get back into that. It certainly, I needed something more low key but I assumed that, in Portland, something in a smaller organization I could handle, but nothing was working out. It was really hard to even get interviews. The interviews that I did get just did not feel, they weren't appealing jobs. The offers that I got, nothing felt right. And so the only thing that was feeling really great was being self-employed. And I was like, well, maybe this is, something trying to push me into a new direction. And so I sort of just decided I would just kind of accept this entrepreneurial path that I found myself on because nothing else was coming through. And did consulting for a little while. And as part of that, thought, as I was supporting employees, got sort of interested in this other role of coaching and like, how could I support employees in a different way? I really liked helping people with their careers, but that's limited when you have your HR hat on or you work for the company, so just kind of on a whim, like put out a shingle to do career coaching for like 5 hours a week. I just rented this little office and just started practicing with like, very low key, like low payment, just total experimentation. And so did that in parallel with some consulting for a little while until I felt like I wanted to fully invest in the career coaching side of it and kind of let go of the consulting role.
I see. So you really, it sounds like you evolved from the HR consulting into the career coaching. So how many years ago was that?
That would have been like 8 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So tell us about now, 8 years ago, was that already called A Wild New Work? When did that name come about?
Yeah, no, I had been just coaching and consulting under my own name, but I had started this blog as part of my work and was, I think through any creative exercise, you really like start to get to know your own point of view and your own perspective. And so as I was writing, I found myself writing more and more about nature and the cycles of the seasons and how really like the dichotomy between the modern workplace, which is so sort of sanitized and linear and industrial, and this whole other world, which is, of course, it's not separate, but this whole other world that is so much more dynamic and alive. And I just started thinking and playing around with this idea of like, what would it mean to bring more of that natural way of being into the workplace? And so, I was just blogging and doing classes. And one of my classes, it was one of those things where like, you're not even really trying, but I needed a name for this class, and a wild new work just sort of arrived. And I was like, okay, like I'm going to use that. So it was just this name of this class that I had offered. And it was a couple of years until I decided like, that's what this whole endeavor really wanted to be called. And that's what really captured the essence of what it is for me. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So tell us more about A Wild New Work, an ecological career development agency. What kinds of things can people avail themselves of if they were to engage your agency?
Yeah. So I do coaching with one-on-one, individuals, and it's a 6-month process that is fairly structured. Of course, it's flexible, but it does go through the cycle of the seasons. It uses the seasons as a model for evolution or transformation. So we start in the fall with the sort of process of like release and grieving what you're walking away from in terms of your career or your professional identity. And then we move into the winter of like, where you're really getting into that period of reassessing and getting down into the soil, and where things are sort of mysterious, and you don't know where you're headed. You just know where you're not anymore. And it's that kind of liminal period. And then in the spring is this process of recultivation, rebirth, where you're starting to pay attention to these new sprouts, these new ideas that are coming through, where you've sort of given them space to, be born. Yeah. And then in the summer, of course, we're looking at like, okay, so what is this now? Like, what came out of that letting go in the fall, and that resting and that growth in the spring, and how does it want to grow even more so that you can benefit from it and share it with others. And so, I do one-on-one coaching in that seasonal model. I also am sort of the founder or steward of this community called Cedar Lodge, which is a group of people who, are working and want to work in ways that enhance their well-being and want to follow this more seasonal way of living and working. I also do tarot readings, which is kind of might seem like a tangent, but is another way to sort of get a different perspective on your path. And so everything is rooted in the fact that we are nature. We're not separate from it, that these rhythms and cycles are ones that we evolved with and that continue to inform us, even though our culture we move through the year in a much more linear way. Right. These rhythms are so natural to our bodies and to our vocational development. Yeah. So that's what it's really steeped in.
Oh, I love that. I've never heard of anybody using the seasons in that way in looking at one's career, but I that really resonates with me. The way you describe that, that's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it's intrinsic to us, right? Like your body knows when it's winter, your body knows when it's summer. Like we can forget sometimes.
Absolutely. It really can. And so there's a resource that you want to make available to our listeners. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, I think a lot about, like, many of my clients will come to me and then they're in this tough place where they're feeling really stuck. And there are these periods where we are maybe resisting that fall, letting go, or we're in that winter where we have no idea what is to come, or like it can feel really hopeless. And so I was thinking about how I could support people who are in that place where you just feel entrenched and like there's no clear way forward. So I put together this 10-day resource. It's called Grounded and Gifted, 10 days of gentle restoration and deeper connection to yourself. And it's just these 10 most helpful writings, meditations, rituals that I do with my clients that just start getting things moving in a different direction. It doesn't have to be this huge, like, leave your job and like move across the country. Like right. I've done that is necessary sometimes, but right. Often I find that people just need to start like shifting their energy and attention in a different way. So this is designed to help people do that. It's really gentle. And so that I'm happy to share the link to that in the show notes if it's helpful.
Yes.
For folks.
Oh, absolutely. We will. I think that's wonderful. And one last question I want to ask you before we wrap up, and that is, although I think the resource that you're gifting to our listeners, which is very generous, but I'll ask the question anyway. If you had to give somebody one key piece of advice about making a transition, a career transition, what might be that one key piece of advice if you were talking to someone who was saying, I'm thinking about what's next for me?
I would say to carve out a daily space and practice where you are connecting and introspecting, and if it's in your practice, journaling, meditating, praying, whatever it is, but to make this daily ritual of where it's just a space where you get to get clarity for yourself, where you get to get still and grounded. That's when things really started to change for me. Once I moved back to Portland, I still have this amazing therapist who said, have you ever tried just meditating? And I had never even really heard of it or done it before, but I literally just started sitting on the floor in my office for like 10 minutes a day. And I made this little altar and I had a journal and I just got still and like wrote down how I was feeling. And that set off this whole series of events of where I was able to connect to finally like some inner clarity and what did make sense to me, and a spiritual perspective that does really ground me and enliven me. And I don't think I would be doing the work I am doing right now if I hadn't started that daily touch point and really committing to that. So even if people don't feel like it's related to their career or like what could that do for them, just that daily ritual. I see it as sort of non-negotiable for me and like for the people I support.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is a great way for someone to just connect with themselves, just to have a moment to themselves where they're not just running on the hamster wheel and in the process of doing. Or as my friend Michael O'Brien says, time to be a human being, not just a human doing. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from that. And many people just don't stop long enough to just do that. But I know that when I stop and do those kinds of things, I find a part of myself that I don't experience otherwise. And it really does. And as a result of that, of feeling that little more inner peace, a little more grounded, other things then become available to you. And you start noticing things and you start taking things in different ways that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it's almost like the gift that keeps on giving in some ways. And it really does allow you to access a part of yourself and access a part of your world that you wouldn't otherwise, I think, if you take some of that time for yourself. In whatever ways you do it, I like the way you just described that, having that ritual. Well, this has been an absolute delight, Megan. I thank you so much for sharing your story and your time. And I can imagine that your clients and the people who you serve are very well served. And we will have all the information in the show notes, all of your connections and your LinkedIn, your Instagram, all of that. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Tammy. This has been really fun. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Megan Leatherman. It was so interesting to speak with her and learn about her background and her current work. What is your key takeaway from our interview? If you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, You can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygoularloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 174. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my new book, Work from the Inside Out, Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career That Fulfills You. It's available now in print and ebook editions through my website, Amazon worldwide, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, and you can request it through your local library. If you were inspired by this episode with Megan, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And please do subscribe so you don't miss next week's show. Remember, subscribing is always free. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate reading your review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to find on my website at tammygoularloeb.com/podcast. Just click on the Apple Podcast button and follow the instructions provided there. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.